when cops have to arrest their buddies. The rain tapped gently on the windshield, blurring the neon signs outside. Officer Jake Carter gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual. His partner, Mike, sat silently, fidgeting with his badge like it weighed a ton. Neither had spoken a word since the call came through. Dispatch had delivered the unthinkable. Suspect is a known associate. Badge number 4531. Jake froze when he heard it. That number belonged to their drinking buddy, Detective Alan Bishop. The squad room's golden boy. The one who cracked impossible cases. But now he was the accused. Charges: corruption, bribery, and evidence tampering. Jake's mind raced. Memories of barbecues, laughter, and late-night stakeouts played on loop. How could Alan betray them like this? The cruiser slowed as they neared Alan's house. The once welcoming porch light now flickered ominously. "Let's get this over with," Mike muttered, stepping out into the cold drizzle. Jake hesitated, his boots feeling like they were cemented to the floor. The door creaked open before they could knock. There he was, Alan, still wearing his department-issued jacket. His eyes, hollow and rimmed with shadows, locked onto theirs. "You're really doing this, huh?" Alan said, his voice heavy with resignation. Jake wanted to speak, but his throat tightened. Mike read the Miranda rights in a robotic tone, avoiding Alan's gaze. The air was thick with tension, suffocating. As Jake reached for the cuffs, Alan held up his hands. "No need for theatrics," he said, his lips curving into a bitter smile. But then Jake noticed something odd. Alan's hands were trembling. Not from fear, but rage. "You don't know the whole story," Alan hissed under his breath. "Don't make me say it here." Jake's pulse quickened. "What does that mean?" Alan's eyes darted to the shadowy figure standing at the end of the street. "You're being played," Alan whispered. A chill ran down Jake's spine. The figure turned and vanished into the darkness. Before Jake could process it, headlights flashed behind them. Two unmarked cars screeched to a halt. Men in black suits poured out, shouting orders. "Step away from the suspect." Jake and Mike exchanged bewildered looks. Alan smirked. "Looks like they don't trust you either," he said, his voice dripping with irony. Suddenly, Jake realized the game was bigger than all of them. Bigger than the badge, the brotherhood, or the truth. And for the first time in his career, Jake felt truly powerless. Jake's hand hovered near his holster, unsure if he was about to defend himself, Alan, or the truth. The men in suits moved with precision, their guns drawn, their faces expressionless. "Detective Bishop is now in federal custody," one of them barked, flashing a badge that glinted under the porch light. "Federal custody?" Jake's chest tightened. This wasn't just about corruption. Alan laughed, a low, bitter chuckle that echoed in the quiet street. "See, Jake? You're just a pawn." Jake's stomach churned. "Stand down," the lead agent commanded. Mike's voice broke through the chaos, trembling but firm. "Someone better start explaining." The agent ignored him, yanking Alan's hands behind his back. "You think you're doing the right thing," Alan said, addressing Jake directly, his tone almost pitying. "But you don't even know who's pulling the strings." Jake took a step forward, but one of the agents blocked him. "Stay back, officer. This is above your pay grade." Above his pay grade? He was a cop. He had a duty to uncover the truth, no matter how high it reached. "Alan," Jake called out, his voice cracking. "Just tell me, did you do it?" Alan's expression softened for a moment. "Would it matter if I said no?" Before Jake could respond, the agents hauled Alan toward their car. "Wait!" Jake shouted, his voice firm now, cutting through the tension. "You owe me something. Anything." Alan turned his head slightly, just enough for Jake to see the faint glimmer of regret in his eyes. "Follow the money," he said quietly, his words barely audible over the rain. Then he was gone, shoved into the back seat of an unmarked car that sped off into the night. Jake stood frozen on the porch, rain soaking through his uniform. Mike put a hand on his shoulder. "What now?" he asked, his voice hollow. Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. The rain continued to fall, masking the tears that now streaked his face. He knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And somewhere deep inside, he feared Alan was right. They were all just pawns in a much darker game. The unmarked car's taillights faded into the stormy night, leaving Jake and Mike standing in the chilling silence. The faint hum of their cruiser was the only sound now, a stark contrast to the chaos moments earlier. Jake's mind raced, replaying Alan's cryptic words. Follow the money. Do you think he's guilty? Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't respond immediately. His gut twisted with doubt, fear, and an unsettling sense of betrayal. But something about Alan's demeanor felt off. Not the guilt of a man caught red-handed, but the frustration of someone trapped. I don't know, Jake finally admitted, his voice hollow. But I'm starting to think we're all missing the bigger picture. Mike sighed, wiping rain from his face. Dispatch isn't going to like us asking questions about this. Jake nodded, knowing the risks. You're right, he said, his tone sharpening. But if Alan's telling the truth, this goes deeper than just him. The rain intensified, hammering against the cruiser as they climbed back inside. Jake sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel but not starting the engine. Remember that drug bust 6 months ago? He asked suddenly. The one Alan led? Mike frowned. Yeah, it was huge, cartel level. Why? Jake's jaw tightened. What if that's where it started? Alan might have uncovered something he wasn't supposed to. Mike's face paled. Like what? A cartel paying off cops? Politicians? Maybe worse, Jake said, his voice barely steady. Something powerful enough to make the feds sweep in like that. Mike leaned back, staring at the rain-streaked windshield. So what do we do? Ignore it? Pretend we didn't just see our friend hauled off like a criminal? Jake's eyes narrowed. No, he said firmly. We find out the truth. Even if it costs us everything. The air inside the cruiser felt heavier now, thick with the weight of what they were about to do. Mike nodded reluctantly. All right, he said. But if we're going to follow the money, we need to start where Alan left off. Jake started the engine, the hum filling the tense silence. Their first stop, the precinct, Alan's office. The place where, if Jake's hunch was right, the threads of a much larger conspiracy were waiting to be unraveled. As they drove, the storm outside mirrored the storm brewing within Jake's heart. He didn't know what they'd find, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about Alan anymore. It was about the kind of cops they were willing to be. The precinct was eerily quiet when they arrived. The glow of fluorescent lights reflected off wet tile floors, and the distant hum of a coffee machine filled the air. Jake and Mike moved quickly, their boots squeaking faintly with each step. Alan's office was at the end of the hallway, its doors slightly ajar. Jake pushed it open, the creak cutting through the silence. The room was as they remembered it. Neat, organized, every file and photo meticulously placed. But something felt off. Start with his desk, Jake whispered. Mike nodded, pulling open the drawers, rifling through files and papers. Jake's eyes scanned the walls. Pinned to the corkboard were photos from the drug bust 6 months ago. Packages of confiscated cash. Names scrawled in red ink. A map with circles drawn around key locations. Jake leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing at one name circled multiple times. Vega Enterprises. Mike, Jake called out. Mike looked up, holding a folder. Find something? Jake pointed to the name. Does this mean anything to you? Mike frowned, stepping closer. Yeah, he said slowly. Vega Enterprises was supposed to be a front for the cartel. But Alan said they couldn't tie anything solid to them. Jake's gut tightened. Then why is it circled like this? Mike opened the folder in his hands, his brow furrowing deeper with each page he flipped. Jake, he said, his voice low. This isn't just about drugs. Look at this. Jake took the folder, his heart pounding as he skimmed the documents. Transactions, shell companies, and payments made to names they recognized, city officials, high-ranking officers, even a judge. This is why Alan said, follow the money, Jake muttered. He was onto something massive. Mike exhaled sharply. And now the feds have him, which means someone's trying to bury this. Jake slammed the folder shut, his resolve hardening. We can't let them. Before Mike could respond, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Both men froze. Jake motioned for silence, quickly slipping the folder into his jacket. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the door. Jake? Mike! It was Captain Reynolds, his voice steady but cold. "What are you two doing in here?" Jake turned slowly, forcing his expression into one of calm. "Just tying up some loose ends, sir," he said. Reynolds' eyes swept the room, lingering on the corkboard. "Loose ends, huh?" He took a step closer, his presence suffocating. "You're not poking around where you shouldn't be, are you?" Jake held his gaze, every muscle in his body tense. "Just doing our job," he said evenly. Reynolds nodded, though his eyes betrayed suspicion. "Good," he said, his tone sharp, "because some jobs aren't yours to handle." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Jake and Mike in a silence thicker than before. Jake exhaled, his fists clenched. "That wasn't just a warning," he said, his voice low. Mike nodded grimly. "Reynolds knows." "And now," Jake said, pulling the folder from his jacket, "so do we." The game had shifted. They weren't just searching for the truth anymore. They were running out of time to expose it. Jake and Mike exchanged a look that carried unspoken resolve. They couldn't trust anyone, not even their captain. "Let's get out of here," Jake muttered. Mike nodded, and they slipped out of Alan's office, their movements cautious but quick. The precinct suddenly felt like enemy territory, every shadow a potential threat. Once outside, the rain had eased, leaving the streets slick and reflective under dim streetlights. Jake climbed into the cruiser, gripping the folder like it was a lifeline. Mike slid into the passenger seat, glancing nervously out the window. "We need somewhere safe to go through this," Mike said. Jake thought for a moment. "Not home. Not anywhere predictable." Mike hesitated. "What about the old storage unit we used during that undercover gig? The one by the docks?" Jake nodded. "Perfect. Let's move." The drive was tense, every passing car and shadowed figure feeding their paranoia. Jake's mind churned as he replayed Reynolds' words. Some jobs aren't yours to handle. He couldn't shake the feeling that their captain was deeply involved. When they reached the storage unit, the air was damp and smelled of salt and rust. Jake parked the cruiser out of sight, and they slipped inside the dark, musty building. Mike pulled a flashlight from his belt, its beam cutting through the gloom. Jake spread the documents from the folder onto an old metal table. "This doesn't just connect to Vega Enterprises," Jake said, his voice steady but grim. "It connects to the whole city." He pointed to a diagram of interconnected names and companies. "Look at this," Jake continued. "Campaign contributions, fake charities, real estate deals. It's all tied to the same people." Mike leaned over the table, his face pale. "This isn't a cartel," he said quietly. "This is a network, a machine." And Alan stumbled right into it. Jake's jaw tightened. "And now they're using us to silence him." Mike slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing in the empty unit. "Why didn't he tell us sooner? We could have helped him." Jake shook his head. "Maybe he tried. Maybe he didn't trust anyone. Not even us." Before Mike could respond, the faint crunch of footsteps outside froze them both. Jake killed the flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. They stood motionless, listening as the footsteps grew louder, closer. Jake's hand went to his holster, his pulse thundering in his ears. Mike's breathing was shallow, his own weapon drawn. The door creaked open slightly, letting in a sliver of moonlight. "Jake, Mike," a voice called softly, almost familiar. It wasn't Reynolds. It wasn't anyone they expected. It was Alan. He stepped into the dim light, his hands raised in mock surrender. "You didn't think they'd keep me, did you?" Jake's heart raced, a mix of relief and confusion. "Alan? How?" Alan smirked, though his eyes held a haunted look. "They underestimated me," he said, his voice low. "But if you're here, it means you found the folder." Jake nodded, still trying to process what was happening. Alan stepped closer, his tone urgent. "Good? Because now you're in as deep as I am." The weight of his words settled over them like a shroud. The lines had been crossed. There was no going back. And somewhere in the darkness, they all knew the fight for the truth had just begun. The air in the storage unit grew heavier as Alan's words lingered. Jake stared at his old friend, trying to piece together how he had escaped. "You're supposed to be in federal custody," Jake said, his voice sharp but low. Alan nodded, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Supposed to be. But let's just say the feds have cracks in their system too. Mike lowered his weapon slightly, still wary. Alan, you're going to have to give us more than cryptic lines if you want us to trust you. Alan sighed, his shoulders slumping. You want the truth? Fine. He stepped closer to the table, pointing at the web of names and companies Jake and Mike had just uncovered. This network doesn't just control Vega Enterprises. It controls this city. Every decision, every law, every crime bust, it's all orchestrated. Jake frowned, leaning on the table. By who? The cartel. Alan shook his head. The cartel is just a piece. A convenient scapegoat. The real power lies with a shadow group. Politicians, corporate moguls, even law enforcement. He looked Jake in the eye, his voice dropping to a whisper. Reynolds is one of them. Mike cursed under his breath, pacing the room. Reynolds? That explains the way he looked at us earlier. He knows we're close to something. Jake's mind raced. Alan, if you knew all of this, why didn't you tell us? Why go it alone? Alan hesitated, his jaw tightening. Because I didn't want to drag you two down with me. You're good cops. The kind they can't afford to lose. Me? I was already compromised. Jake's stomach twisted. Compromised how? Alan looked away, shame flickering across his face. I took a bribe. Once. Years ago. Thought it was harmless. But they used it to get leverage on me. He turned back, his expression hard. When I tried to break free, they set me up. The corruption charges, the bribery. It's all real, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. Mike stopped pacing, his face pale. So, what's the play here? We can't go to the precinct. We can't trust anyone. Alan nodded. Exactly. Which is why we need to go public. Leak everything. Jake shook his head. They'll bury it. They'll bury us. Unless we have undeniable proof. Alan smirked, reaching into his jacket. I was hoping you'd say that. He pulled out a USB drive, holding it up like it was a holy relic. This, he said, is every transaction, every connection, every dirty deal they've made. It's the key to taking them down. Jake's heart raced. Where did you get this? Alan's smirk faded, replaced by a grim expression. I had to make some sacrifices, but trust me, it's legit. Mike glanced at Jake, his eyes filled with doubt. If we use this, we're declaring war. Jake nodded, his jaw set. Then we better make sure we win. Before they could say more, the sound of tires screeching outside shattered the moment. Headlights flooded the room through cracks in the walls. Alan's face hardened. They've found us. Jake grabbed the folder and USB drive, shoving them into his jacket. Mike back exit. Now! The three of them bolted, adrenaline surging as the sound of boots and shouts filled the air. The storage unit erupted into chaos, a battleground between those fighting for the truth and those desperate to keep it buried. And as Jake sprinted into the darkness, he knew this wasn't just a fight for Alan's innocence. It was a fight for everything they stood for. The badge, the truth, and their lives. The cold night air hit them as they burst through the back exit of the storage unit. Their breaths came in sharp gasps, the echoes of shouting and slamming car doors behind them growing louder. This way, Alan hissed, motioning toward a narrow alley that led to the docks. Jake and Mike followed without hesitation, their footsteps splashing through puddles as they ran. Flashlights swept the area behind them, beams of light cutting through the darkness. Jake glanced over his shoulder, spotting shadows closing in. They're gaining on us, he growled, adrenaline spiking. Alan veered left, leading them behind a stack of rusted shipping containers. Just a little further, he panted. Jake caught up, his mind racing. We need a plan, Alan. Running isn't enough. Alan stopped abruptly, turning to face them. That USB has everything we need, he said, his voice low but intense. But we need to get it somewhere safe, somewhere they can't touch. Mike's eyes darted around, scanning for threats. And where exactly is that? Alan hesitated, his jaw clenched. There's a journalist. Someone I trust. She's been digging into this for years. If we get this to her, she can blow it wide open. Jake's brow furrowed. Do you really think a journalist can stand up to this kind of power? Alan met his gaze, his voice steady. She's the only chance we've got. Before Jake could argue, a bullet ricocheted off a nearby container, sending sparks flying. Move! Mike shouted, pushing them forward. They darted between the containers, the sound of gunfire and heavy boots echoing behind them. The docks opened up ahead, the vast expanse of dark water shimmering under the moonlight. Alan led them to a small, unmarked boat tied to the pier. "Get in," he ordered, untying the rope with shaky hands. Jake and Mike climbed aboard, their weapons drawn as they scanned the shadows for their pursuers. More shots rang out, one splintering the wooden pier just inches from Alan. He dove into the boat, starting the engine with a roar. "Hold on!" The boat lurched forward, cutting through the water as the shouts and gunfire faded into the distance. Jake slumped against the side, his chest heaving. That was too close. Alan didn't respond, his focus on steering the boat through the labyrinth of docks and open water. Mike leaned over, his voice tense. "So, where are we going?" Alan glanced back, his face lit by the pale glow of the moon. "To someone who can help us finish this fight." Jake tightened his grip on the USB drive in his pocket, his mind already preparing for the next battle. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And as the boat disappeared into the darkness, Jake knew one thing for certain. The truth was worth every risk. The boat skimmed over the dark waters, the hum of the engine blending with the gentle lapping of waves. Jake kept his hand near his holstered gun, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. Alan was tense, his knuckles white on the wheel. "How far is this contact of yours?" Jake asked, breaking the heavy silence. "About an hour upriver," Alan replied without looking back. Mike leaned against the edge, his face drawn with exhaustion. "I hope whoever this journalist is, they're worth it," he muttered. Alan's eyes flickered with determination. "She is. Her name's Dana Wells. She's been trying to expose these guys for years, but never had the hard evidence. This," he said, patting the pocket where the USB had been tucked, "will change everything." Jake nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. "The longer we're out here, the more time they have to regroup. We need to be ready for anything." As if on cue, a faint beam of light appeared in the distance. Jake squinted, his stomach sinking as the light grew brighter. "Alan," he said, his voice tight, "we've got company." Alan cursed under his breath, cutting the boat sharply to the left. Behind them, another vessel came into view, its engine roaring louder as it closed the gap. "They found us," Mike said, pulling his weapon. Jake grabbed his own gun, steadying himself against the rocking boat. "Alan, can this thing go any faster?" "I'm giving it all. It's got." Alan shot back, his voice strained. The pursuing boat was larger, sleeker, and gaining ground. A spotlight from the other vessel swept over them, momentarily blinding Jake. "Get down," he yelled, pushing Mike to the deck as gunfire erupted, bullets whizzing overhead. Alan zigzagged the boat, trying to make them a harder target, but the distance between the two vessels was shrinking fast. Jake returned fire, his shots cracking through the night, but the attackers were relentless. "They're too close," Mike shouted, reloading his weapon. Alan's face was grim as he shouted over the chaos. "Hold on, I've got an idea." He veered sharply toward a cluster of mangroves, the boat nearly tipping as it slid into the narrow, twisting channels. Branches scraped against the sides, and the engine sputtered as Alan maneuvered through the tight space. "Are you trying to get us killed?" Mike shouted, gripping the edge of the boat. "Trust me," Alan barked, his focus razor-sharp. The larger boat hesitated at the entrance to the mangroves, its spotlight sweeping the area. Jake held his breath, listening as the enemy boat's engine idled. Then, the sound of a smaller dinghy splashing into the water reached their ears. "They're coming on foot," Jake whispered. Alan killed the engine, and the three men crouched low, the boat drifting silently deeper into the maze of mangroves. The sound of footsteps and voices echoed eerily through the trees. "They won't stop," Alan said, his voice barely audible. "Not until we're dead or the drive is destroyed." Jake met his gaze, his expression hard. "Then we'll make sure neither of those happens." As the voices grew closer, Jake tightened his grip on his weapon. The darkness pressed in, every sound amplified, every movement a potential threat. The hunt was far from over, and in the suffocating silence of the mangroves, The real fight was just beginning.
The boat drifted deeper into the mangroves, the air thick with humidity and tension. Jake could hear the faint slosh of water as their pursuers closed in. Alan gestured for them to stay quiet, his eyes scanning the dense shadows for an escape route. Mike wiped sweat from his brow, his voice barely a whisper. "They're splitting up. I can hear them fanning out." Jake nodded, his ears straining to pick up every sound. The mangroves were a maze, but that worked both ways. If they could stay ahead, they had a chance to lose their hunters. A twig snapped nearby, followed by a low voice giving orders. "They can't be far. Check every corner." Jake's grip on his weapon tightened. He motioned to Alan and Mike, signaling them to move silently along the narrow path between the roots. The water was shallow here, their steps slow and deliberate to avoid splashing. Alan leaned close to Jake, his voice barely audible. "If they get the drive, it's over. You know that, right?" Jake nodded grimly. "They won't. Not while I'm breathing." Suddenly, a beam of light cut through the mangroves, sweeping dangerously close to their position. The three of them froze, crouching low behind the twisted roots of a large tree. The light lingered for a moment before moving on, but the footsteps grew louder. "They're coming this way," Mike whispered, his voice tense. Jake glanced around, his mind racing. They needed a distraction. Something to throw the hunters off their trail. Spying a loose piece of wood floating nearby, Jake picked it up and hurled it into the water a few yards away. The splash echoed loudly, and the voices reacted immediately. "Over there," someone shouted. The light shifted, and the footsteps moved in the opposite direction. Alan exhaled softly, relief washing over his face. "Good thinking," he whispered. Jake motioned for them to keep moving. They wove through the labyrinth of roots and branches, each step a careful calculation to avoid making noise. The mangroves thinned slightly, revealing a small clearing ahead. In the center was a patch of dry land, a rare sight in the swampy maze. Alan pointed toward it. "We can regroup there. Figure out our next move." They hurried to the clearing, their boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. Jake crouched, scanning the area while Alan and Mike caught their breath. "We can't keep running forever," Mike said, his frustration evident. Jake nodded. "Agreed. We need to take the fight to them." Alan hesitated, then reached into his jacket, pulling out the USB drive. "This is the only thing that matters," he said, holding it up. "If one of us gets out, they take this to Dana. No matter what." Jake met his gaze, the weight of their situation clear in both their eyes. "We all get out," Jake said firmly. Alan didn't respond, but the look on his face suggested he wasn't so sure. Before they could say more, the sound of voices returned, closer and more organized. "They've tracked us," Mike said, his voice low. Jake stood, his weapon ready. "Then we make our stand here?" The clearing turned deadly silent, the only sound the distant rustle of leaves. The first figure emerged from the shadows, his weapon drawn. Jake didn't hesitate. A single shot rang out and the man dropped. Chaos erupted as more figures burst into the clearing, shouting and firing. Jake, Alan, and Mike moved like a well-oiled machine, their training kicking in as they returned fire. Bullets tore through the air, the crack of gunfire reverberating through the mangroves. Jake's heart pounded as he ducked behind a fallen tree, taking aim at another attacker. Alan crouched nearby, firing in quick, controlled bursts. Mike was on the opposite side of the clearing, covering their flank. But the enemy kept coming. For everyone they took down, it seemed two more appeared. Jake's mind raced. They couldn't hold this position forever. And then, through the chaos, he saw it, a small motorboat tied to a tree at the edge of the clearing. "Alan, Mike," he shouted over the gunfire, pointing toward the boat. Their eyes followed his gesture, and understanding dawned. "Cover me," Alan yelled, sprinting toward the boat. Jake and Mike laid down, suppressing fire, their bullets keeping the attackers at bay as Alan reached the boat. He jumped in, fumbling with the ropes to untie it. "Get over here," Alan shouted. Jake motioned to Mike. "Go. I'll cover you." Mike hesitated but obeyed, darting toward the boat as Jake continued firing. As Mike climbed aboard, Jake turned and sprinted, his legs burning as he closed the distance. A bullet whizzed past his ear, and he dove into the boat just as Alan gunned the engine. The boat lurched forward, cutting through the water as gunfire erupted behind them. Jake looked back, watching as the clearing disappeared into the darkness. They had escaped for now, but the battle was far from over. And as the boat sped toward an uncertain future, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the real fight was still ahead. The boat skimmed over the water, the roar of the engine muffling the distant gunfire. Jake sat against the edge, his chest heaving, the metallic scent of spent gunpowder clinging to the humid air. Alan's face was a mask of concentration as he steered them through the winding river, the moonlight their only guide. Mike leaned back, clutching his shoulder, his fingers slick with blood. "You're hit," Jake said, crawling toward him. "It's just a graze," Mike muttered, though his pale face said otherwise. Jake grabbed a first aid kit stashed under the seat, his hands steady despite the chaos. He ripped open a pack of gauze and pressed it against the wound, earning a hiss of pain from Mike. "Stay still. We can't afford to lose you," Jake said, his tone firm but laced with concern. Alan glanced back, his voice strained. "How bad is it?" "He'll live," Jake replied, tightening the makeshift bandage. "But we need to keep moving. If they catch up, we're done." Alan nodded, pushing the engine harder. The boat carved through the dark waters, the dense trees on either side forming a tunnel of shadows. Jake couldn't shake the tension gripping his chest. Every rustle of leaves, every splash of water, felt like a threat. "They won't stop," Mike said, breaking the silence. "Not after what we've seen." Jake met his gaze, the weight of their mission pressing down on him. "They can't erase the truth," he said, pulling the USB drive from his pocket. "Not if we get this to Dana." Alan's voice cut through the tense quiet. "We're close. Another 10 minutes, and we'll reach the drop point." Jake nodded, though unease churned in his gut. The closer they got, the more vulnerable they became. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the trees, a gunshot. "Down!" Jake shouted, pulling Mike to the deck as a bullet tore through the side of the boat. Alan swerved, the boat tilting dangerously as more shots rang out. "They've got us in their sights," Alan yelled, his voice strained. Jake peeked over the edge, spotting a second boat emerging from the shadows. Its spotlight lit up the river, illuminating their escape route. "They're hurting us," Jake shouted, firing a few rounds toward the pursuing boat. Alan cursed, cutting the engine and letting the boat drift into the shadows of an overhanging tree. "We can't outrun them like this," Alan said, his voice low. Jake's mind raced. "We'll have to split up. Draw their attention." Mike shook his head, his face pale. "That's suicide, Jake." "It's the only way," Jake insisted. He looked to Alan. "You take the USB and get to Dana. Mike and I will hold them off." Alan hesitated, his jaw tightening. "No. We stick together." Jake's eyes burned with resolve. "If we all stay, they'll catch us. You know that." Alan clenched his fists, the weight of the decision evident. Finally, he nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Make it count, Jake." Jake handed him the USB, their eyes locking in silent agreement. Alan restarted the engine, the boat surging forward as Jake and Mike prepared to jump. As the pursuing boat drew closer, Jake fired a final round, then leaped into the water, the cold shock of it stealing his breath. Mike followed, the two of them vanishing beneath the surface as Alan's boat disappeared into the night. The river was cold and silent, the muffled hum of engines above their only indication of the chase. Jake surfaced first, his lungs burning as he gasped for air. Mike emerged beside him, his face grim. "Think he'll make it?" Mike asked, treading water. Jake's gaze lingered on the direction Alan had gone, the weight of their sacrifice heavy in his chest. "He has to," Jake said, his voice resolute. "Because if Alan didn't, everything they had fought for would be lost." The river was a dark expanse around them, the moon casting a dim reflection on the rippling water. Jake and Mike treaded water quietly, listening intently. Above, the sound of the engine grew fainter, and the pursuing boat's spotlight swept over the water, briefly illuminating the area where they'd disappeared. Mike's breath came in shallow gasps as he scanned the distance. "How long do we wait?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Jake didn't answer immediately, his mind calculating their next move. "Just a bit longer," he muttered, eyes darting to the far bank of the river. They had to keep moving, out of sight, away from the eyes of the men hunting them. Finally, when the sound of the engines faded completely, Jake gave a small nod. "Let's go." The two of them swam toward the far side of the river, each stroke silent but urgent. The shore was muddy and slippery, but they managed to pull themselves up, their soaked clothes weighing them down. "Where to now?" Mike asked, breathless as he adjusted his grip on his weapon. Jake's eyes narrowed, scanning the surrounding forest. "We move inland. Find shelter. We'll figure out the rest there." Mike followed without a word, his footsteps heavy in the wet earth. They moved through the dense underbrush, the sounds of the night around them muffled by the weight of their situation. For a while, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath their boots. But then, a twig snapped. Jake froze, his hand going to his sidearm. "Did you hear that?" Mike whispered, his tone sharp with concern. Jake nodded slowly, his senses alert. "Stay close. We're not alone." The rustling sound grew louder, and Jake motioned for Mike to take cover behind a tree. They crouched low, listening. Seconds felt like hours as the noise drew nearer. Then, a figure stepped into view. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a weapon in hand. Jake's hand tightened on the grip of his gun, his eyes narrowing. But before he could make a move, the figure's face became visible under the low light of the moon. Jake's breath caught. It was Alan. He was alone. "Alan!" Jake called out in disbelief. Alan's face was streaked with dirt, his clothes torn, but he was alive. He held up a hand, signaling for them to stay quiet. "I lost them," Alan said, his voice rough. "How?" Mike asked, coming out from behind the tree. Alan smiled, though it was a grim expression. "I know these waters better than they do. They never had a chance." Jake let out a long breath, his heart finally starting to slow. "You got to Dana?" Jake asked, his voice low with urgency. Alan's expression darkened. "I didn't get the chance. I barely made it out. But we still have a shot. There's another contact, a safe house a few miles from here." Mike frowned. "A safe house? How do we know it's not a trap?" Alan looked at them both, his eyes hard with resolve. "Because if it were a trap, they'd already have us. We're not the only ones who want the truth to come out." Jake hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Lead the way." They moved again, this time with a renewed sense of purpose. The forest stretched out before them, thick with shadows and uncertainty. Every rustle, every creak of the trees felt like a threat. But there was no turning back now. They had come too far. And the truth, no matter how dangerous, was something they couldn't let go of. As they walked deeper into the unknown, they knew one thing for certain. The fight was far from over. And the only way out now was to finish what they had started. The air grew colder as they pressed on, the forest becoming thicker, the moonlight barely filtering through the dense canopy above. Jake led the way, his senses on high alert, every snap of a twig sending his heart racing. Mike and Alan followed closely behind, their footsteps nearly silent on the damp ground. They didn't speak much, each man consumed with his thoughts, aware of the danger that still loomed over them. The safe house, if it truly existed, was their only hope now. Alan's expression was grim as he navigated the terrain. "We should be there soon," he murmured, though his voice held a note of uncertainty. Jake nodded but didn't say anything. They couldn't afford to let their guard down yet. Then, through the trees ahead, a faint light flickered. "That's it," Alan whispered, his voice barely audible. The light grew brighter as they approached, revealing the outline of a small cabin nestled between the trees. The structure looked old, worn, but solid. They approached cautiously, weapons at the ready. Alan stepped forward first, knocking on the wooden door in a specific rhythm, 3 short taps, 1 long tap. They waited, the seconds stretching into what felt like an eternity. Finally, The door creaked open, revealing a man who looked as though he hadn't seen daylight in days. He eyed them warily, his hand resting on the doorframe as he studied their faces. "Alan," the man said in a low, gravelly voice. "You're early." Alan gave a sharp nod, stepping inside quickly. "We ran into some trouble," he said. The man stepped aside, allowing them to enter. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by a single oil lamp. A table sat in the center, scattered with maps, papers, and empty coffee mugs. A fire crackled quietly in the small stone hearth, casting long shadows on the walls. Jake scanned the room, his eyes darting to the windows, searching for any signs of an ambush. "Who else is here?" Mike asked, his voice still laced with suspicion. The man looked at him, then back to Alan. "No one," he said, closing the door behind them. "I work alone." Alan nodded, his expression tense. "We need to get this to Dana. The clock is ticking." The man gestured to the table, where a small device sat, its screen flickering with static. "That's the burner phone," he said. "It'll connect you to Dana. She's expecting a call." Jake stepped forward, grabbing the phone. "Thanks," he said, his voice tight with gratitude. The man didn't respond, turning back to the papers scattered across the table. Jake, Alan, and Mike exchanged a quick look before Jake pressed the phone to his ear. The line crackled for a moment, then a woman's voice came through, clear but urgent. "Jake." "Dana," Jake said, his voice strained. "We've got the evidence. It's all here." "We don't have much time," Dana said, her tone sharp. "They're closing in on me. I'll be ready, but you need to move fast." Jake's heart raced. "Where do we meet?" "Not far," Dana replied. "I'll send you the coordinates. Get there as soon as you can." Before Jake could say anything else, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, a wave of uncertainty washing over him. "Do you think we can trust her?" Mike asked, his voice low. Jake didn't answer immediately. He wanted to believe in Dana, believed that this was the woman who could finally expose the truth, but there was always doubt in the back of his mind. "We have no choice," Jake said, his voice hardening. "We make the drop, and then we get the hell out of here." Alan nodded, his jaw set. "Let's move." They gathered their things quickly, preparing to leave the cabin. Jake didn't know if they were walking into another trap, but he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever came next would be the final test. The cabin door opened once more, and the three men stepped out into the dark, quiet forest. The air was colder now, the tension thick as they moved toward their next destination. In the distance, the faint glow of a distant light marked the spot where their paths would cross with Dana's. But even as they pressed on, Jake couldn't shake the nagging thought in his mind. Were they being led straight into a trap, or was this their last chance to put an end to everything? The forest around them seemed to close in as they moved deeper into the night. The unknown awaited them, and whatever happened next would determine everything. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the quieter the world seemed to become. Each step felt like a test, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Jake's senses were on high alert, every rustle of the leaves making his heart race. Behind him, Mike and Alan moved in silence, their eyes scanning the shadows, ever watchful. As the minutes ticked by, the unease in Jake's chest grew. They were getting close now. The coordinates Dana had sent led them to an old, abandoned warehouse near the edge of town. A place that looked deserted, but Jake knew better than to assume anything. "Stay sharp," he whispered to the others. Alan's eyes flickered toward him, his grip tightening around his weapon. The warehouse came into view, looming like a ghost in the night. The windows were dark, the buildings seemingly lifeless. But Jake knew better than to trust appearances. There was something off about this place. He couldn't explain it, but a cold shiver ran down his spine. They approached cautiously, taking cover behind a row of abandoned cars just outside the warehouse. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he scanned the surroundings. The light from the distant street lamps barely reached the warehouse, casting long, jagged shadows. "Do you see anything?" Mike asked in a hushed tone, his voice tight. Jake shook his head, keeping his eyes trained on the building. "I don't know yet," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. They waited in tense silence. Every passing second felt like an eternity. Then, just as Jake was about to make a move, the sound of footsteps echoed from inside the warehouse. His body tensed, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, her face partially obscured by the hood of her jacket. "Dana?" Jake called out, his voice uncertain. The woman stopped, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then, the figure pulled back her hood, revealing a face Jake had never seen before. She was younger than he expected, her eyes sharp with an intensity that made him wary. "I'm not Dana," the woman said coolly, her voice laced with a cold edge. Jake's pulse quickened. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, taking a step forward. The woman didn't flinch, her gaze unwavering. "I'm someone who can help you," she replied. Jake's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. "Why should I trust you?" he asked, his voice tight with suspicion. The woman took a slow, deliberate step toward him, her eyes locked on his. "Because Dana is already dead." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. His breath caught in his throat as the weight of her statement sank in. "What?" Mike's voice cracked with disbelief. The woman's expression didn't change. "They killed her 2 days ago," she said flatly. "We're the ones who have been watching you." Jake took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "This is a setup," he muttered, his mind reeling. "No," the woman said, shaking her head. "It's not a setup. It's a chance. A chance to finish what you started." Jake narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" The woman stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You've got the evidence. The world needs to see it. But if you hand it over to the wrong people, they'll bury it. They'll bury everything." She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle in. "You're not the only ones who want the truth out." Jake looked at Mike and Alan, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Everything was different now. Dana was gone. The woman in front of them was their only hope. But could they trust her? Jake's fingers twitched around his weapon, a battle raging inside him. "Tell me what you want," he said, his voice low and steely. The woman's lips curled into a faint smile. "Only one thing. Finish what you started, and we'll make sure you get what's yours." The promise hung in the air, thick with the uncertainty of what it truly meant. The woman turned, her footsteps echoing in the silence as she walked toward the door of the warehouse. "Come on," she called over her shoulder. "Time's running out." Jake looked at Mike and Alan one last time. They had no choice but to follow her, because now there was no turning back. They followed the woman inside the warehouse, their every step echoing in the vast, empty space. The air was thick with dust, and the faint hum of distant machinery only added to the eerie silence that hung in the air. Jake's heart was pounding as he moved deeper into the warehouse, his mind still reeling from the revelation about Dana. "Where is she taking us?" Mike whispered, his eyes scanning the shadows. The woman didn't answer, leading them to a small office tucked away in a corner. She paused at the door, turning to face them. "Once you hand over the evidence, you'll be free to go. But understand this, what happens next is out of your hands." Jake didn't like the sound of that, but there was no choice. He nodded and followed her into the office. Inside, the room was stark, just a desk, a chair, and a file cabinet. She motioned to the desk. "Place the evidence there." Jake set the burner phone on the desk, his hands trembling slightly. The woman picked it up, her fingers brushing over the screen as she studied it. "You did the right thing," she said, her voice softer now. But Jake wasn't convinced. "Who are you working for?" he asked, his eyes narrowed. The woman met his gaze, and for a brief moment, there was something almost human in her eyes. "I'm not the enemy," she said quietly. "We're all just trying to stop the ones who have too much power." Jake didn't trust her, but he didn't have time to question her motives. He turned to leave, but the woman's voice stopped him. "You'll never know the full truth. Not all of it." Jake's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low. She didn't answer. As they stepped outside, the woman's figure disappeared into the shadows of the warehouse. Jake, Alan, and Mike stood in the night, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. It wasn't over. It never would be. But at least they had done what they could. And now, it was up to the world to uncover the rest of the story. The truth had been set in motion, and there was no turning back. As they walked away from the warehouse, the dark sky above seemed to close in, as if the world itself was watching, waiting for what would come next.